Good evening to all of you, and welcome to our conversation entitled White Men Missing in Action. This is the latest in the Racism is Real dialogue series organized by Roots of Justice, where we seek the liberation of all persons from oppression and envision a world where work for justice and love enables all to live authentic and fulfilled lives. We have a systemic and intersectional understanding of racism, heteropatriarchy, classism, and all other oppressions, which means that we can't address oppression without examining how institutional and systemic power operates and our role in it. We offer a variety of workshops, retreats, and consulting services. And if you want to learn more about us, please visit our website at rootsofjusticetraining.org. We also want to be clear that this evening's conversation has been organized by those of us who are on this panel in accountability to women and trainers of color or BIPOC trainers in our collective, in the Roots of Justice Collective. The larger context of a more than 500-year history of the system of white supremacy in this country, as well as the more recent context of the election of a white nationalist as president, immediately following the election of the first Black president, has led us to the deadly coronavirus pandemic, disproportionately devastating BIPOC communities, and simultaneously the nationwide Black Lives Matter uprising following the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, as well as the police shooting and maiming of Jacob Blake most recently. That was also followed by the vigilante murders of 2 protesters and the injuring of a 3rd. One of the common threads through all of this is the dominant role that white men like myself have played in creating and maintaining the brutal and violent system of racism and white supremacy, from Christopher Columbus to Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old white vigilante accused of murdering the 2 protesters and injuring a 3rd in Kenosha, Wisconsin just a few days ago. While the more blatant forms of violence dominate the headlines, we also know that every single system in this country, whether we are talking about housing or healthcare or education or immigration or criminal punishment or any other system, continues to devastate Black, Indigenous, Latinx or Hispanic, Asian, and Middle Eastern communities, while both benefiting and dehumanizing white communities, including those of us who identify as white men. We also know that throughout the history of white supremacy, there have been white men who have joined the resistance. In the approximately 20 years that I have been actively involved in anti-racist organizing work, however, my observation is that those of us who identify as white men almost inevitably represent a small fraction of organized action to undo racism and other oppressions, if we are present at all. Hence today's title, White Men Missing in Action. I'm not sure how many of you are out there today, but just judging from how many signed up as going and how many were interested, I'm guessing that I have never been in a space with as many white men as we have today in this Zoom meeting, in this Facebook live stream event, for the purpose of talking about our role in the broader movement. So this is exciting for me. The planning for this event has been a collective effort, and with the limited time that we have for today's conversation, we want to highlight just a few questions related to our role as white men, past, present, and future, how we have been shaped by, and how we continue to shape systems of oppression. Obviously, in 1 hour, we will only get our toes wet, but our hope is to spark ongoing conversations, and beyond conversations, collective action, so that future generations of white men in accountable relationships with each other, with those of all genders, and with BIPOC organizers will no longer be missing in action. We are now going to introduce ourselves briefly before we get into some of the questions that we want to talk about today. My name is Rick Dirksen. I live in Seattle, Washington, and so I am living on what is Duwamish land. This is unceded and occupied Duwamish land that I live on here in Seattle. I am an anti-racism educator and organizer with the Roots of Justice. Have been for a number of years, since I believe since the year 2001. I am also an organizer with a white anti-racist collective that organizes here locally called European Dissent, and that's spelled D-I-S-S-E-N-T. And I'm an organizer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, another national organization that does undoing racism workshops all over the place. I am spouse. I am parent of 3 adult children, all of whom are married. I am a grandparent of 6 amazing and wonderful granddaughters, all under the age of 7. And I'm obviously a white guy. I identify as a Christian. I'm middle class. I'm straight. I'm cisgendered. So in every aspect of my identity, I'm on the privileged I'm on the privileged end of the spectrum, and so that's how I have come to understand myself. But that's a little bit about who I am, and I'm going to hand it over to the others on this panel.
Well, I am Phil Maurice Brubacher, and I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a fine city, and y'all should come and check it out sometime. I have been involved in anti-racism work for approaching 25 years now in various capacities as staff or as trainer. Right now, my involvement is as a trainer with Roots of Justice. In addition to that, I am a spouse and a father. I am mostly a full-time parent, and I also work part-time for a small nonprofit here in Tulsa. And I'm glad to be here and to share what experience that I have, which I don't think of as expertise. And I certainly don't consider myself to be a particularly good anti-racist most of the time or anti-sexist. But it's a journey that I am committed to. Next.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Tobin Miller-Shear. I'm John and Vel's son. I'm Cheryl's life partner, and I am a parent to my adult sons, Dylan and Zach. I live in Missoula, Montana, as Rick does, on land of an unceded community, the Salish and Kootenai peoples. I work at the University of Montana, where I'm a history professor and direct the African American Studies program there. Use the pronouns he, him, his. I've had the honor and privilege of being part of anti-racism work for about 3 decades, and with Regina Shan-Stoltzfus was the co-founder of the Damascus Road anti-racism process, which is now Roots of Justice. And I'm just delighted to be part of this conversation, and particularly to be in this virtual space with these 3 other men who I have nothing but respect for and value as colleagues, and from whom I have learned so much.
My name is Nick Myron. It's great to be on here sharing some time and space with you, Rick, Tobin, and Phil, and everybody watching. I am currently in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, land that was historically inhabited by Susquehannock and Lenni Lenape, who were renamed Delaware. I'm a bus driver. I drive a motor coach, following in my father's footsteps. He does that part-time, and so do I. I've been intentionally anti-racist for about 15 years, and anti-sexist, working for liberation for masculinity for about 17 years now. And I do that work with Roots of Justice, and I do the work with some folks in the area here. I am a father. I'm a husband. I have a cat who may jump on my lap at some point this evening, and it's a pleasure. This is a conversation that it gives me life. There's a few people in Lancaster I've met that I can have an authentic conversation dealing with race and gender. And so anytime I'm a part of a group like this, it's very soul healing for me. So I appreciate this time and space with you folks. So our Zoom event tonight, or Facebook event, sorry, was about white men missing in action. So we thought to start off, we would all talk about why we used to be missing in action, and possibly we'll get to ways that we still are. We're going to be doing a lot of conversation tonight around masculinity, around race, as Rick was saying. But we really want to also start off from the understanding that, as Phil said, we're not experts, but we all know what it means. We all know how to be a white man, and we all have come through a certain process and journey to be where we are now. And for myself, that journey started as a white man who didn't understand what it meant to be a white man. And so before I got into this, before I was intentionally anti-racist, I was, I guess, intentionally racist. Of course, I didn't think of myself as that way. And I think part of the reason that I didn't initially latch on to anti-racism work and anti-sexism work was because, one, I didn't know what they were. My understanding of race was definitely at individual level. I knew who the bad people were, and they were the KKK, Bull Connor. I remember learning about that in history class. And so, of course, I thought, well, as long as I'm not those people, I'll be okay. But I think at possibly an even deeper level, I was very consumed with myself. And of course, I didn't think of myself in that way, but I was an individual, and I thought of myself in complete individualist terms. And so my movement and perspective of the world were solely shaped around my relationship to it as a person. And so as a young person, and as a growing older person, as an adolescent, in my teens and in my early 20s, the things I responded to in the world and the way I responded and how I thought about myself were all based on me, myself, and I guess would be the way to put it. And so as long as I wasn't saying those things and doing those things, I was okay. And at the same time, I was fully focused on the hurt and pain that I experienced, because I did experience some. I wasn't in school what you would consider well, I can tell you, I wasn't in school my peers considered to be a man's man. I wasn't tough. I wasn't competitive. I used to enjoy playing soccer, and I had fun if we won or lost. And that's not great for coaches who want to win and teammates who would do anything to win. So I didn't get along well in those ways. But what I did was I took that and completely internalized my way of being in the world as the pain that had been inflicted on me. And so I made my life all about myself. And that consumed me for the first 20 plus years of my life until I began to understand what oppression really was. But we'll get to that later. But yeah, that's what kept me absent for the first few decades. I was self-consumed, individualist.
That kind of resonates a little bit with me, Nick, about individualism and sort of focusing on myself. In a way, it feels a little different. Like I would narrate my journey in that a little differently. Namely, that I grew up in a very religious family. I think it's fair to say. And so it was always very important to be good, to be a good person, and to do the right things, the holy things. And so that was very important. And I've learned in reflecting on all of that, that having that focus be on my own goodness, it is another way of being very individualistic and not thinking about others, and not looking to love, and not looking for actual justice, because I'm more focused on whether I am the good person as opposed to whether the world is a just place. So I think that's it. To go back to the question about why was I missing in action, through much of my life, I think yes, it's because I was trying to achieve something for my own rightness more than I was invested in liberation of myself and others.
I love this question, Nick, and I'm so grateful for you articulating for us as we were talking ahead of this conversation. And my first thought when you asked the question was that the reason I was missing is because I thought that I wasn't. I thought that I was engaged in the struggle. And so my background was very liberal. I thought of myself as radical, but all that work had never asked for any sort of reflection on the systems of racism, the systems of patriarchy. I was particularly focused on Central American solidarity, which was a good thing to do, but I think in some very deep ways, it was an evasive maneuver to not have to deal with the reality right in front of us. And it was that shift, largely coming through the work of the organization that Rick is now affiliated with, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, that brought that in very direct ways to my attention. And I think if that had not happened in that way, where there was not a challenging moment, I probably would still be thinking that I was doing it, even though I wasn't. So it's that self-delusion, I think, is part of it. And it's particularly an issue, a stream, a pattern within the white male liberal community that I've noticed and seen reflected, not just in my own story, but those around me. So thanks again for that question.
Yeah, I also want to thank you for the question, Nick. I identify with so much of what Phil and Nick and Tobin have already shared in response to this question. The one thing that I will add in terms of why I was missing in action is that I grew up in a missionary family. I was the child of missionaries. And as an adult, the first thing I did basically was to go somewhere as a missionary. I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where my wife and I worked as missionaries for about 20 years. And then I came back and I attended my first anti-racism training and got into this work. But, you know, with that background, I was heavily, heavily like submersed in what I would call white savior complex, or if you want, the missionary, sort of the missionary mentality, right? In some circles, you know, people would now talk not so much about, use the word missionary because that's not cool. It's kind of passé, it's out of vogue. And so people will sometimes talk about service. I actually see those as being very similar. But I grew up in a religious tradition which really emphasized, the missionary thing, and so the white savior thing. Whether we talked about being missionaries or whether we talked about being service workers, it was kind of the same mentality that I grew up with and that I internalized. And so I see that as being a huge factor in why I was missing for a long time before I woke up to the reality of my whiteness and the reality of my maleness as well.
When I saw the topic that we were all going to be exploring tonight about white men missing in action, I was reflecting on a class I recently taught on dismantling racism, had like over 200 people participating, but the ratios were absolutely stunning to me, of about 9 identifying women for every 1 man. And that's been consistent. We were talking again earlier about how often in training environments, anti-racism training environments, that's the same sort of ratios, maybe not quite that lopsided, but I think, Nick, you were saying you thought 60, 70%, somewhere in there, of women versus men. I've got some thoughts about it, but I'd like to hear from the 3 of you first about why do you think that is? I mean, that particular dynamic of those willing to step forward, to get some training, to be part of taking action. Why are we missing? Why are we as white men just not showing up even in the room to even talk about taking action, let alone taking the action?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a good question too, Tim. And I was thinking about this as I was hearing some of you respond to the other statement or question. I think part of it too, and a reason I was missing earlier on, but I think part of it still is the men don't want to talk about anything that evokes feeling, because some of the conversations we have, and I tell people, especially if there's a higher number of white men at some of the spaces I facilitate, I'm forthright in saying, look, I would have found this kind of foo-foo stuff ridiculous, 20 years ago. I would have felt super uncomfortable. I wouldn't have wanted to do it. And so I think for a lot of men, and like I said, I'm counting myself among those, it's the possibility of opening up some conversation that can lead to feeling, emotions, and some kind of depth about ourselves. Vulnerability is not something I have found white men comfortable or willing to do very often, and I certainly wasn't less than half my life ago. Not something that I was actively engaging in.
Rick, what were you going to say?
Well, I guess I was reflecting on all the answers we shared to the question of why we on a personal level, we're missing in action. I mean, I think they're related to probably why other white men, people who identify as white men, are also missing in action. I really think that our society socializes us to believe that we have the answers, and we know what needs to be done. We know what's important, and that whatever it is we've chosen to do is the most important thing to do. So anything else has got to be less important, less significant, and we'll let other people, do all of that kind of stuff. I think that's certainly, been a part of my socialization. And so, and touching on the emotions, I'm glad you talked about feelings, Nick, because, this has been a huge learning curve for me. Just doing this work is getting in touch with my own feelings and then being able to express my own feelings, right? Because that's also not how I was socialized, either as a white person or as someone who identified as a guy, as male. I was socialized not to feel my feelings, and certainly, if I did feel them, to hide them, right? To keep them sort of under control, so to speak, and not really express them. But I have found it to be very liberating, to be able to identify and name my feelings, and also to be able to express my feelings. So I think that, yeah, for me, that's certainly an important aspect of this.
Well, I'm reminded, Rick. Go ahead, Phil. You were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to second the bit about the feelings and emotions, and the way that men in general, and I think white men in particular, have been raised to, not be allowed to feel things, except lust and anger. And like having grown up in a very religious family, I wasn't allowed those two either. And that hasn't served me well. Yeah, and I think it makes it, even when I like got in the room of anti-racism and anti-sexism, that history and that early shaping of my emotional life hinders me. Like even now, I mean, it's something I have to work on, and you all can, have a conversation with my wife just to know how much work I have to do on this still. But yeah, I think that's a really important aspect of how we can get into the room and how white men can continue to engage this work in a critical, self-reflective kind of way. And it brings up a question. I'm following along in the Facebook comments. There was a question that kind of relates to this. But Tobin, you were maybe about to say something, so I don't want to move on if you had.
No, go ahead, Phil. It's fine.
Okay. I'll mention this question. This is from Aaron Marin. White cis men really struggle to expand, challenge their ideas when presented alternatives by women, especially partners, BIPOC or LGBTQ folks. What do you find engages the curiosity and helps soothe the fear?
I think having language to understand what is keeping us from those kinds of natural, normal, and frequent collaborative connections across gender lines, across racial lines, if we don't know the barriers to that kind of connection, I think we don't have any sort of language of how to move forward and make that in a way that's not defensive, and as the person writing the query asked, engages our curiosity. And I think this connects what I was going to say earlier. Let's see. Earlier this year, I was involved in this huge controversy around some Martin Luther King Jr. Day events at our university that ended up just sort of blowing up on social media, and I ended up being the focal point of that. In the first stages of that, I found myself going into these three connected spaces that I think we as white men also as our default: to shame, to isolation, and to sense of fear of failure. And as this was unrolling, I found myself caught up in all three. I was afraid of the public exposure. I immediately started isolating myself, and I was overwhelmed with shame. Fortunately, I knew enough from being at this for a long time that I couldn't stop there. So what I did is I reached out to Rick and some other friends, and I called them up and talked it through, and I was crying most of the time and aware of those spaces. But I think the thing that got me to going from that sense of isolation was knowing that those were things that I might do, that I might have that fear, I might have that isolation, I might have that shame. And then if someone like Rick that I could call up and just, process that stuff with was hugely helpful in not letting me stay in that place and just crawl in my shell and not try to do this work ever again. And I think having that language to talk about those dynamics that are consistent over time can be helpful to us to name them and then let them have some less power over us in the process. But I'm really grateful, for example, in that instance, of someone like Rick, that I could help get me out of those spaces that I think I would have just sort of sunk into otherwise.
Yeah, a lot's been written about male friendships and how difficult it can be for men to have those kinds of friendships, to be able to share and be more intimate than just sitting and having a beer while you watch the game or whatever it is that manly men do. I don't care about sports, so but I hear that that's a thing.
But I think that's a partly an answer to the Facebook query too. so men, other white men can hold ourselves accountable to kind of stopping our need for control. Because I think, and I'm sure you've all seen this white man, but even in anti-racist training spaces, you know, and Tobin and Squeak that we were talking about before this, you have the guy that sits like this the whole time. And the one time he says something, he'll say, well, this here's the thing. You know, they know the thing, and they try to boil all of racism, sexism, heterosexism, all of it down to just one single thing that we need to do. And I think part of that comes from, well, Rick alluded to earlier, is that we're told we're right, and we know things. We're men, we're white men, and we know things. I think also part of it is the need to control our narrative and the understanding we have of what society is about, so we know our place. Because if we don't, then there's total fear and chaos inside. And almost to what you were saying, Tobin, about the shame, it's a little bit different circumstances, but there's isolation and shame in not knowing where we fit in. Yeah. And so we have to control knowledge, and our perceptions of things have to be correct, because otherwise we don't know who we are, where we stand. Every Thanksgiving holiday, when we get together, it's the only time of year my father's side and mother's side all gather for a meal. My father's family is ethnically Jewish, and so there's no animosity at all. It's just that we don't celebrate the holidays together. And we get into a conversation that usually happens when everybody else leaves the table, and it's well, I shouldn't say some people leave the table, some people stay. We play some games, and then inevitably one of the people at the table start a conversation, and it's only a matter of time before the 6-7 people around the table are down to about 3 people who are talking. My one uncle, my other uncle, myself, and my dad, who kind of steps in and steps out. And we've had women in the family tell us that they don't feel like we're giving any space or credence to what they're saying. And this is still recent. So I think, Phil, you said how it's a process and a journey, right? And so this is stuff I'm still working through, because I hear that and I care. And so I'll pause until my one uncle says that thing, and then I just have to interject, right? Because I know the one thing that'll get him to stop. I know it. And I've never actually said it. It's a fallacy, right? But yeah, there's so many forces. And anyway, to get back to the thing, I think if we continue circles like this, then someone else can say, Nick, you don't need to talk. You can stop. You don't have to control. You don't have to know. Just knock it off.
So one of the things I was reflecting on, with this question, and also what the rest of y'all were sharing, is this whole notion of fragility. I'm guessing that some of you, maybe most of you, are aware of the work that someone called Robin DiAngelo has done on white fragility. What strikes me as ironic is that we as white males are actually extremely fragile. We've actually been, I think, socialized to be fragile. So like when we get angry, that's one of the emotions, as you said, Phil, that we're permitted to have and to express or whatever. We don't know how to manage that, right? We have very limited ways in which we can express that. Excuse me. But I'm just thinking of the whole notion of fragility and realizing that as a white man, my fragility is on steroids, because I've got the white fragility and I've got the male fragility, and it's like, whoa, and yet we've been, taught that we are somehow supposed to be the strong ones, right? And all of that, it's really a myth. It's just not the case.
Yeah, reflecting on what it means to be strong, and the messages that white men and white boys received growing up, and like how strength is so important, but then how that is framed into a picture of masculinity, that really, as you were saying, Rick, like makes us really fragile at the end of it. We don't have we're not trained into any sort of real resilience. And there's so many better ways of being strong than, running around on the school playground like I learned. Not that I really engaged in it because I was always too little. I would get like crushed. But playing games that were explicitly anti-gay, or at least an anti-gay name. I won't repeat it here. You guys probably know it if you grew up in, the same general era as I did. But yeah, it's all about that physical power and putting other people down. And we're not trained to envision a more comprehensive and creative imagination of power. And that's really sad.
Phil, how are you exploring that with your sons? I know Rick has a son. I've got two sons. You've got two sons. I don't know about you, Nick, but what are you doing now with your sons, like in terms of exploring that?
Well, I am blessed to have a wife with great emotional intelligence. So I learn a lot from her, and and she teaches the kids a lot also. And I, do my best to support that and model that also. And, and trying, I don't know how many times my kids have seen me cry. Because I haven't kept track, but it's more than a handful for sure. And so I hope that by displaying that's one small thing. But also our household, we like intentionally set it up where I have been, since the beginning, I've been the primary parent, and my wife has focused on, the career and making money. And so I think that also has been an intentional choice that we made to, that, puts masculinity in a more caregiving role than typically happens by default. Not that everybody should do that, but that's just sort of one way that it's played out.
Yeah, thanks. That's great modeling you're doing there.
Yeah, I think I probably missed out pretty much on being able to model in that way, because by the time I started becoming more aware of my internalized whiteness, my internalized maleness, masculinity, my kids were grown up. They were definitely certainly past the age where they're absorbing everything and being shaped in significant ways. The one thing I can think of is that, when we did move to Lancaster, Pennsylvania back in 1998, together, my partner, my wife and I, we made the decision that I would be the stay-at-home parent for a number of years at least, and she would be the one exercising her profession. And so, there was that kind of modeling that happened in terms of roles, right? But in terms of the emotional stuff, for example, and some of the things we're talking about today, we've had good conversations now, like my son and myself, and I have two son-in-laws as well, married to my daughters, but, we have great conversations as adults. But I don't feel like I really had the opportunity to model that kind of thing with my son Jeremiah when he was younger.
So I'm remembering when our youngest son, Zach, was doing a stand-up bit. He hadn't let us see his stand-up comedy for many years, or many months when he was working on it, but he said, okay, you can come this night. So we came to it, and it turns out he'd done this whole routine on being raised the son of a white guy who did anti-racism work. All of it was at my expense. It was hilarious, but it also has made me reflect and have conversations with both he and his brother about whether we made it too much a part of our conversation, because we were talking about racism all the time. When stuff would come up in their kindergarten class, we would, we'd organize around it, and we organized around something. I brought them around the neighborhood collecting signatures this one time when the police had accidentally released tear gas in their predominantly Black and Latinx elementary school. And I wondered if we pushed it too hard. They say we didn't. And it's just, I'm always amazed by how wonderful these young men turned out despite the errors that I've made, particularly as their father. But I think the one thing we did get right, maybe to an excess, was simply talking about this stuff. That we brought it up. We didn't talk around it. We talked about it. And times that I've read things that my sons have written about racism, Dylan's written this great article about exploring racism and to a degree sexism in the improv scene in Chicago, and Zach's written stuff along those lines. It's moved me deeply to see them choosing to make some anti-racist and anti-sexist choices as men, as adults. It's been very gratifying.
Yeah, I certainly second those conversations. We often have conversations about racism and sexism, and we make sure that the kids see some films that highlight those things. And that I think is also an important part of how men can, raise up anti-racist and anti-sexist children, whether boys or girls or other genders. While I'm talking, there was another question that sort of relates to this. What are effective ways to engage white men's fragility? So how can we engage that? And what first comes to my mind in that, and I think this works for me as a white man if I'm trying to engage another white man. I just think it's really important to be confessional and to say, to tell my story and the ways that I've screwed up. So I'm not pointing fingers, but I talk about my own racism, my own sexism, because that doesn't, raise the white male fragility or hackles or whatever you want to say, the defensiveness that can come up, because what do they have to be defensive about? I'm talking about myself. But hopefully that can prompt some self-reflection and bring a sort of connection for them. So that's the first thing that I do in that situation.
Yeah, my thought was, I think along the same lines as yours, Phil. Like when you use the word confessional, I try to, as best I can, I try to model vulnerability, because I feel like that's, because of a lot of the things we've already talked about, I was not socialized to be vulnerable or to make myself vulnerable in terms of my emotions. And so, if I am going to be inviting other men, and in particular other white men, to be vulnerable and to make themselves vulnerable, then I need to model that. So, whether it's in just regular conversations or in training settings, I also like to share stories, from my own experience. And I've often, cried or been brought to tears even in the course of a training because of the various emotions that come up as I share some of my own experiences, whether it has to do with family or work or whatever it is.
I've not seen it so much among anti-racism trainers, but I have in the broader progressive community, where one of the expressions of white maleness, our masculinity, as we're seeking to be anti-racist, can be becoming aggressive, not only towards people like you just described, Phil, but towards each other, as if somehow it's a way for us to prove just how badass and anti-racist we are if we're beating up on each other. And one of the things that I very deliberately made the choice to do when I'm leading workshops or I'm in the midst of conversations is I've just stopped trying to convince anybody of anything. That I'm just not going to be competitive about trying to convince the person I'm in a conversation with about my anti-racist commitments. Like you, Phil, like you, Rick, I'm just going to tell them what I know to be true, what's true in my experience, and let the ideas do their own work. And the more I've disengaged from that sort of competitive rhetorical exchange, I think in the end, the more effective I've been at opening some doorways to having further conversation down the road. But this stuff loops around back on itself in such disturbing ways, all these boomerangs that come around, even in the midst of trying to become more anti-racist and anti-sexist. Because of our social conditioning, we can end up enacting those racist and sexist values in the midst of the work itself. And I think that's where these kind of conversations can help us become more self-aware of that, and we're not engaged in that sort of competitiveness, which is, I think, often a default for those of us who condition as white, straight males.
Yeah, that kind of goes along with what I was thinking too. I try to model vulnerability as well. I believe it's crucial to be authentic people, which I think we have to be in any space. I try to be vulnerable all the time, not just when dealing with fragile men. I'm still fragile in some ways too, So yeah, I think modeling that is absolutely crucial. And I also believe, yeah, Tobin, I agree, is trying to be aware enough of ourselves to not engage in that spiral that can easily overtake a training. Because the reality is, we're not going to reach all white men, and I don't feel like I need to try. It's not the white men in training spaces. It's not the white men that I feel like I have a responsibility to. And at the same time, understanding that we still need to engage white people and white men. So it can be tricky, but disengaging from that back and forth ego rally, I think is important, as you were saying, Tobin.
Yeah, and I'll augment what you guys are saying, that I think that's a good principle, not only in training situations, but just in everyday life or on Facebook or whatever. You try to beat somebody over the head with it, it's not generally not going to be very effective. People are just going to come away hurt and more, entrenched. I see the time. We have about 10 more minutes left, and I know that some people on the comment thread on Facebook are saying, well, what are some action items or lists and things like that. And I know that we had talked a little bit about having, talking about some principles to guide how we are involved in the world, and maybe sort of dancing around that, but we haven't laid things out. So maybe we could spend the next few minutes that we have talking about that, some of those principles or guidelines about how we can engage in racial justice and gender justice movements.
I've done a little thinking about this question. I'm in a sort of a unique role where I frequently am asked to come in and be the white guy in the room to address a particular issue around race. And I sort of developed these 5 principles that I can just quickly name that I'm always asking myself I'm asking what's the role that's being proposed, because I think there are some times where white guys should be stepping into a role to, especially if we're dealing with other white folks or dealing with white anger, that's a really important role to fill. What are the responsibilities that come with that role? Asking ourselves about our self-identity, where the request is coming from, what the context of the role is for those responsibilities. It makes a big difference if it's a request coming from a group of white administrators in a predominantly white institution, or whether it's coming from the BIPOC community directly, which is the next question, is what kind of accountability to the BIPOC community is being fostered by whatever role I'll play. And then there's a question of payment. Is there money involved? And it's always got to be on the table. I'm not saying that, particularly in training capacities, white people should never be paid for the work that we're doing, but I think we have to be very transparent about that and ask how the money's flowing, who's getting it in the end, and how that is carrying itself out racially. So there's lots more to say about that, but those are a couple of questions that I'm always asking myself about my role as a white male in a particularly a fraught space where race has come into the surface.
I'll just add a couple of thoughts to what Tobin just shared. For me, one of, I guess, the things that I always have to remind myself of in doing any of this work, and this is something that I think you, Nick, talked about earlier, but you know, you mentioned the individualism and how much you've been shaped by that, and that's very true for me too. But for me, it's just critically important that I do this work, whether it's undoing my internalized whiteness or my internalized masculinity or any other aspect of my identity, to do it collectively and to do it in the context of authentic, accountable relationships with people who are the targets of these different oppressions that we're talking about. And you know, I mean, I still have to fight the desire to want to just, you know, kind of strike out on my own and do my own thing. Remind myself that, no, I need to go back to, you know, the people that I'm in relationship, people like you, or other people that I'm in relationship, you know, here where I live, and continue to do this work collectively. So that's, and that's the only way accountability, I think accountability can happen. I know that people talk about accountability a lot and we try to figure it out. And sometimes I've been a part of, you know, creating some formal accountability mechanism or group. And, you know, maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but I think it's really more about the relationships, authentic relationships that are, you know, the foundation of any sort of accountability. So that's huge for me. And the other part that goes with it is also what we've already talked about. And that is, you know, doing the work of undoing, like just constantly working to undo my own internalized racism, my own internalized sexism, and not expecting other people to do the heavy lifting for me. You know, not expecting BIPOC folks to do the heavy lifting, whether it's, you know, educating myself or the emotional stuff, the healing that I need to do from my own fragility, all of that, or anything else, whether it's, you know, planning any sort of action, for example, whether it's a direct action or something educational or whatever it might be. Because again, my tendency is to sit back and let other people do the heavy lifting. And so I have to continually remind myself that, you know, I need to do this work. And I need to be constantly reminding myself to do it.
Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts. My principles aren't very different, of course. And you can boil it down to a few big things maybe, and then have all the nuances, you know. But for me, it's important to know my role, know when to speak and not to speak, never speak over or for BIPOC, but, you know when to amplify, know when to do the heavy lifting, know when to step back. So those things are important. And I guess the only thing I would add is, and it's in line with the undoing the internalized racism, but I think white men have got to get in touch with their feeling side. I think one of the things that's led me most in this work is connecting my mind and my heart you know, with my body. And so my body feels things, my heart feels things, my mind thinks things, and it's a mess if I don't understand those processes, how they're happening, because it can often feel that they're distinct from one another, not connected. And so when I can begin to connect myself with all of myself, that for me has been a huge, has enabled me to really step hugely into the internal work that's necessary for dismantling racism and sexism. So knowing what whiteness did to me, and knowing what masculinity did to me, not more so than other people, but knowing what it did to me, so that I can be fully authentic when I go into spaces, and when I'm by myself too. I think that's a principle for me that's essential.
Yeah, that's a good list that we're sort of informally putting together, and I second all of those items. And that the relationship business about like where I think about like so many white people and plenty of white men have been out on the streets wanting to be active in their communities over the last number of months, and that's excellent. I'm so excited to see that happening. And for those who are doing that work, which is important work, always be asking where those relationships are. Where are your relationships to this march, this protest? Who are you listening to? And if the people you're listening to are not people of color, then look for who the people of color are who are leading in your community. They're out there. That may mean that you need to show up at places that you don't otherwise go to. And that's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to be awkward. And you're going to screw up. And you're probably going to do racist things. But that's okay. Have some, grace for yourself. And keep showing up and keep wanting to do better. And if you keep doing that, you'll eventually start to build some trust. Maybe not. Trust is not something that anybody owes us. Never. It's never owed to us. It's always a gift. Yeah, that's what I would add to that great list that you guys started. And I see it is now at the top of the hour, so our official time is done. I see at least one or two calls on the list for saying this has just scratched the surface, and it's true. We had a list of like 16 topics that we wanted to cover, and we may have covered a few of them. So maybe we'll be back and do it. I think another session of the Racism is Real series coming soon will be the Black women's group Redux. So we don't, I think, have a date for that yet, but be looking for that. Like our Facebook page if you don't already, and pay attention to it. So thank you to my colleagues who joined us for this. Any final words, anyone? Before we close it out. All right. And thank you all out in Facebook land for joining us. Take care.
Come and go with me.